Well, hi there, and welcome to Foreflight's teaching and learning presentation. This is our Foreflight course based primarily on instructors and students. We're going to talk about some great things about when to introduce EFBs today, how to use them in your flight training environment, some of the tools and tips that we can use to make that experience for our students just that little bit better. About myself, my name is Thomas Daugherty. I am with the Foreflight team for about 6 years now. I am a double I and a commercial multi-engine pilot in a past life before Foreflight came along. A little bit about what we're going to talk about. So, as we always do with our Foreflight presentations, we're going to start off with a couple of new things. Always like to make sure you guys are up to date with the latest and greatest. We're going to have a quick discussion on EFBs and best practices. Some, my thoughts and Foreflight thoughts on how to use EFBs and some ways that we can introduce them. We're going to talk specifically about how to use Foreflight's EFB when we're teaching, some of the tools that we can use, some of the techniques we have available to us. We're going to talk a little bit about some post-flight tools. This is always important, and I think this is one of the ways where EFBs can help us way more than a non-digital solution can in the same capacity. And then if we have some time there for questions, we can go ahead and have those too. So to start off on what's new. Our first thing here in performance is an update to our performance 3D review. So now we've got flight tracking. You can see your motion as you go through. We're flying around, I think, in the Swiss Alps here. Super cool to be able to get that isomorphic view of the airplane as we fly through terrain, as we fly through maneuvers. An excellent one of those post-brief tools, like we mentioned earlier. We also have 3D preview now, including approaches with our leg information in there as well. And you can see that some of our approach waypoints there have altitudes on them. We have the names, that it's an initial approach fix or an intermediate fix. For instrument students, this is such a great way to brief the entire approach before we go fly it. And that way they're ahead of the aircraft before we even get into the airplane. We've now got the ability to make marked positions by using the marked positions button on the little teardrop on the left-hand side over there, and we can save those points along our route. I think this is very handy for making notes about a particular maneuver or a particular point that I want to review with a student later on. It's really handy to have those little saved points, and they save onto your track log as well. So when you go to review that track log later, you can actually see all of those saved points. And it makes it really easy to, review different things that you had along your flight. We also have the ability to do arrival time planning now as part of our performance tier. So just like you're used to flying normally with estimated time of departure, estimated time of arrival just makes it a little bit easier. Maybe you have a time constraint that you need to get back by. Now it'll tell you when you need to depart by so that you can make it back for whatever meeting or event you've got later on. We have internet traffic now available. So partnering with FlightAware, we have the ability to show traffic, just like you have in the air on an ADSB device, available to you on the ground over an internet connection. Fantastic tool for looking at traffic flows around unfamiliar airports, just briefing on traffic patterns in general or airport ops in general to be able to see live aircraft fly around those same things just makes it so much clearer. Foreflight now fully supports split screen. And this is fantastic, I think, if you've got multiple apps that you're running in to view different stuff. So, here I've got my moving map on the right, and I've got a document for like my POH up on the left. And I'm able to, maybe I'm looking at my school's scheduling software. Maybe I've got a document that I need to review like this. I can see both of them at the same time and really kind of complete that information for a student. This has been a long requested one, and we're happy to finally have timers brought into the app. So now I have the ability to both count up and count down just from the More tab over there. Super handy, particularly if you've got an instruments unit trying to work on maneuvers, or if you've got someone on a cross country and they just need to time legs in there. Super handy to have available to them. So that's all for right now for what's new. So let's talk about electronic flight bags. and how we use them as instructors and in the flight training environment. So the first thing I want to touch on is sort of the legal requirements of EFBs here. And kind of the most common question we get out there is, am I able to use my Foreflight Mobile EFB on an Apple device as my sole source of publications in the cockpit? And the short answer to that is yes. I can use my EFB as a replacement for any of my published FAA documents in there. So we've got a couple of reference notes here for you, so if you want to follow up on those. But the short answer is I can use Foreflight in place of those paper documents. But if that's all I'm going to have with me in the aircraft is an EFB, it's going to be really important that I have a backup available. If something were to happen, maybe I forget to download something, maybe my device overheats or I forgot to charge it. We'll talk a little bit about more of that later. But it's really helpful if I've got a backup source of that information available, if it's going to be the only source is in Foreflight. Thankfully, Foreflight is going to provide multiple device licenses for you so that you can have it up on multiple devices. So our standard subscription is going to include 2 iPads and 1 iPhone, and that's going to allow you to have that backup ready to go in your pocket. I used to fail EFBs on students as an emergency practice in there, and I was always happy when they could just pull out an iPhone and had their their flight plan loaded up and their approaches loaded, and they were all ready to go right there on their backup. So if you're going to use it as your sole device, definitely recommend having a backup available. So I want to talk a little bit more broadly about EFBs here, and kind of what is the purpose of these devices. And to me, that is to maximize the situational awareness. If I can use that, if I'm seeing the same information that I saw on paper charts of the same variety, what am I getting on top of that? And that is situational awareness. We want to make flight planning more efficient and enjoyable. We often talk about how expensive and all of the barriers to entry we have for students completing at least like their private pilot. If we're spending a lot of time having those students manually flight plan, practice a lot of these skills that are important for them to learn, but once they have them down, can we be more efficient and can we use that student's time and that student's dollar a lot more effectively than just having them continually manually plan something? So a real goal is to take something like this, where an old flight bag like we used to have, and turn it into something much more accessible, much lighter, easier for somebody to bring all of this equipment along with them, and increase the usability that somebody gets out of each of those pieces of information. So some best practices for EFBs. I think one of the first ones is to teach yourself how to use your EFB of choice. Just like we can't learn or we can't teach landings until we ourselves know how to land the aircraft, you can't really teach somebody how to use an EFB effectively if you're not familiar with how to use it yourself. Foreflight's going to provide you a few different options for learning how to use the product better. Right there in the documents catalog under the Foreflight drive, we've got the Pilot's Guide to Foreflight Mobile. This is the user's manual for the aircraft. It can be downloaded onto the device and saved for use in flight, out at the FBO with a bad internet connection. Have that downloaded ready to go so you can look stuff up, on the fly when you need an answer to something. We've also got guides for filing and weight and balance and all sorts of other, just smaller pieces of Foreflight if you want to get up to speed with all of those. We also have our excellent video library at foreflight.com/videos, and this is going to include all of our webinars and our snippets of different features, making it very easy for you to get up to speed with new features or get an overall view of the app. I also really recommend those videos to students as they tend to like watching a couple of videos on YouTube over sitting down and reading the whole pilot's guide here. And that's going to be a great way for them to get up to speed on how to use different sections in Foreflight. So when and where to introduce EFBs, another really common question that we get from other instructors. And I think the best thing to think about is it doesn't all have to be at once. We want to weigh all of these different factors as to what type of student and what that student is working on and what aspects of an EFB can we introduce at that time. So it's good to think about the fundamental manual skills versus the efficient use of the student's time, as I mentioned earlier. I still think it's important for students to understand how an E6B works, to understand how a plotter and a sectional are used to chart a course through there. Those are excellent skills for them to have so that they understand the fundamentals of what's happening behind the screen on the EFB. And if they were ever in a situation where they needed to manually review something, they would be able to, understand those, at least those fundamentals of the manual versions of doing things. But once a student has those fundamentals down, can we make a more efficient use of that student's time? Having them practice a chart flip on a long cross country over a couple of different sectionals, after the second or third time they've done it, shouldn't we be in the aircraft teaching them other important things? What is your student going to do in their future flying here? I think this is a big one. Is this just a private pilot who wants to, putz around on the weekend and fly to pancake breakfasts? Or is this an ATP student, with their eyes set on the 121 world looking to go airlines? Is this somebody that's going to be flying a, classic warbird, or are they going to be in a modern glass cockpit? And, this kind of affects how they're going to use EFBs in their day-to-day life and how you should be teaching them. Somebody in a private pilot is probably going to want to use, basic flight planning inside of the EFB, but that's really about it. They're going to be flying cross countries. They're likely not going to need, all of the bells and whistles that they have available to them. But somebody going the ATP route is somebody who's going to be, progressing through their commercial and their instrument. And it's going to be more helpful if they know how to use all of the tools available to them. I think conversely, on the warbird versus glass cockpit side, if I have an aircraft that's fully capable of providing advanced avionics information to me, I have a lot of those in the aircraft. I maybe don't need quite as much information out of an EFB. That being said, it's a great backup, and especially if something were to happen, I had a failure in my glass cockpit, it's excellent to have all of that information. But if I'm flying a classic aircraft that doesn't have any of the modern glass cockpit technology in it, then I can be adding quite a bit of functionality to that airplane by having a student know how to use their EFB correctly. What is the student working on? What type of training are you doing? Is this a 141 that is going to have ground school associated with it, that's going to have multiple follow-up courses from their instrument to their commercial? Maybe I don't need to get through every piece of EFB training in my private pilot. Maybe I can piecemeal in some of these things. Or is this a Part 61 student where who knows where they're going to go after they achieve their private pilot's license? I want to make sure that they have all of the tools that they're going to need right at the start, and they're able to go out in the world and have all of those EFB skills. This is a big one. Is this a pre-solo or a commercial multi-engine student? Pre-solo, that's already a tough thing for students. That's already a pretty heavy overload of what's going on for them. We don't really need to add a whole lot more. And they're not doing a whole lot more outside of probably the traffic pattern in here. So maybe we use the EFB for things like the airports page, where we can look up frequencies, or an airport diagram to help them feel less lost around around the taxiways and a little bit more familiar, like they have a GPS in their car. Versus a commercial multi-engine student who we're going to expect a very high level of accuracy in their flight planning out of them. We want to make sure that they're, fully situationally aware in the case of an emergency and we need to divert. And so I want them keeping up to speed on changing weather conditions, maybe through an ADSB unit brought in through EFB. So think about the type of student and what type of training that they're working on. And then think about the individual lesson itself. If we're going off and doing ground reference maneuvers, we probably don't even have the iPad open. Maybe I do as an instructor, where I'm making sure we're in the correct practice area, then I'm making sure we don't have traffic around us. But the student, ground ref, the student's eyes are entirely outside of the aircraft as they go through and try and reference the ground through all of these maneuvers. Versus a partial panel lesson for an instrument student, where we want them to be able to use the aircraft on its own to fly partial panel through a maneuver. But once they've got those kind of basic skills, maybe we want to show them all of the tools that they have available. So if this were to happen in a real life situation, they would be able to utilize their EFB as a, as a primary display inside of the aircraft, potentially with a backup AHARS unit in there, and use all of those tools in an actual emergency situation. It's a lot safer version of partial panel. And then we want to think about, is this the first lesson where we've practiced this skill, or are we just getting ready for a check ride in here? The first time we introduce the skill, we want to do it sort of the basics. We want to do sort of the more manual way of doing a lot of these things and practice those skills, versus once we're getting ready for a check ride, so, as soon as that student passes, they're off into the world. And we want to make sure that they have all of the tools in their toolkit and complete knowledge of how to use that EFB. So once we've got a plan, how are we going to integrate that EFB usage into our training? And as I mentioned, I think one of the best things to do is to progressively integrate it into your flight training. First lesson in here, maybe we're just using the airports page. Maybe we're just looking at, a frequency. This is what a student is using to look at the weather so we can have discussions on our go, no go. They're looking at AFDs or FBOs to look up information in there. Maybe a little bit further along, they're using the taxi diagram so that they have their moving map in there. They can make annotations. They can see their hotspots and their NOTAMs on there. Maybe that's one of our first actual flight lessons. To, an advanced instrument student, where we're looking at synthetic vision, we're looking at an approach overlaid with radar onto the low end route here. We've got a lot of information shown here, as this can really augment a partial panel approach for a student. Create a training outline for both you and your student. The same way that training course outlines are used in the 141 world, it's really helpful to have them built up and designed for your EFB training. So give students standards that they need to adhere to. Don't just say to a student that, oh, you need to know how to use Foreflight by our next lesson because you're going to use it on your cross country. What are they actually trying to achieve? What standards, what benchmarks do they need to be able to hit so that they can prepare before our lesson in here? And then think about it for yourself as well. The same way that we need to look at training courses for how do I take somebody from 0 hours to a private pilot? How do I take somebody from 0 EFB knowledge to competency that they can use it inside of the aircraft? And so letting them prepare by having those lessons mapped out across their entire flight training, it's just going to make it a lot easier, and it's going to seem a lot less daunting for students as they learn all of the ins and outs. I think it's fantastic to start this even before you get into the airplane, as you're in your ground schools. As one of the things that Foreflight includes is all of the publications of the handbooks from the FAA. This to me is such a game changer, to be able to have all of these available documents right there for a student and not require them to go out and purchase them for their own. One of my favorites there, the Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. There's a couple of great snippets in there that I like to talk about when we're going through and talking about aerodynamics of the aircraft. But it's not the sort of book that I expect a normal student to go through and read cover to cover, and I don't want them to have to go out and buy it on their own. It's provided right there inside of Foreflight. We can use additional pieces of information that the student wouldn't normally have access to because it's right there loaded into our EFB. And on those documents, you can make notes and annotations as you go through. And if you make these on your student's device, that's going to make their review of this information significantly more effective. As here I've gone through and I've made some notes about our standard traffic pattern, things that I want them to hit, things that I want them to keep an eye on. And that way, when they're going back and reviewing this information on their own later, it's sort of like I'm there giving them little reminders, little hints as we go through. So use the annotations tools on those documents to highlight the pieces of information that are particularly important for you. And I think it's great. As I mentioned, you can expose your students to so much more. One of those cases, I think, is all of the different charts and maps that you have available to yourself. A lot of my flight training was at the University of North Dakota. North Dakota, not famous for its congested airspace up there. So if we wanted to go look at something like the San Francisco class Bravo, a very complicated piece of airspace, we might have to go and buy an actual paper chart for it. But now I can go through and look at all of the sectional charts and the tacks for students all over the country. And so I can show them particularly busy airspace, or I can show them, less congested airspace if we're just trying to get the basics down. I think it's also cool to show them kind of unique features around there. The top left is one of my favorites. This is a walrus warning around a lot of the coast of Alaska and some along the California coast up there. I just think that's kind of a fun one to show that, there are, how would you fly over this area as you go through? To charts like helicopter metro charts, or even like the IFR continental planning charts that you couldn't probably find a paper version out there if you wanted to. I think it's great to use the EFB in our pre-brief. Even, if we're not going to use it necessarily in the flight, can we use it to pre-brief a student so that they're, more familiar and ahead of the aircraft before we go and hit the ignition? So we can talk about an approach plate where, this is one of my favorite ILSs into Fargo, where you're on the arc for a very short period of time. If we're talking about arcs to an ILS with a student, I can go through and show that they're not going to be there for very long using the nav log. It's only a few seconds that we're on that arc before we need to turn in on the ILS. Make sure that they're prepared and ready to go to intercept because they're not going to have time to tune radios any different than what they're set up on. I've got a standard traffic pattern overlaid with satellite imagery. Very handy to show highways, to show particular landmarks that a student can use as a reference if, say, they're just getting used to entering the traffic pattern to unfamiliar airports and they're trying to figure out what's a half mile, what's a mile. You can go through and set landmarks for them to review. And that way, when you actually go and enter that traffic pattern at that airport, they sort of have a target in mind of how far out they should be for things. To transversing through complicated Class Bravo airspace here using the profile view, very easy for them to see all the different aspects of that airspace, see exactly what part of that airspace we're going to be in as we transit the area, and make sure that they have all of their frequencies and they're prepared to talk to whoever they need to talk to as we fly through that area. So on to some cross-country planning. What are some things that we can do to, really stretch out the EFB and use it to plan those cross countries more efficiently and have students much more up to speed before we actually go fly, so that they spend more time, monitoring the things that we want them to monitor inside of the aircraft and less time kind of lost because they're not really sure where they are. So I've got a kind of a basic route here as we fly through some mountains. And I'm looking at the terrain profile view. And this is a flight that a student might have brought to me. And they say, yeah, this route looks great. Look, we clear those mountains right there. We've got a 450-foot clearance. That sounds like plenty to me. And we want to inform that student of just how close that is, how little clearance that really is, and impress upon them why we might want to look at a different route. One of the ways that we can do that is by hitting the 3D button on the route planner there. And then we can actually get a 3D preview of that route as we fly through. We can speed up, we can slow down, we can pan and zoom around as we fly through here. And we see that satellite imagery overlaid on terrain. So as we come upon our close obstacle here, we can show just how close to that piece of terrain the flight actually is. That it may not be as comfortable as it says 450 feet sounds when we're sitting on the ground. So we can show them just how close they're going to be to that, and then we can pan and zoom around to look at this terrain and see if maybe there's a low spot nearby, a piece of terrain that would be better for us to try and fly around. So this is a great way to have a conversation about what do clearance levels actually look like, and if we're flying into terrain, what sort of things do we want to avoid. One of my favorites here, if you have an Apple Pencil and you bring it into the iPad inside of Foreflight, you're actually going to activate the map annotation tool automatically. This makes it really handy to be able to make quick notes on the maps page so that I can go through and, make a note for a student that I want them to switch their fuel tanks here. I want to make sure we have ADS grabbed by a certain point, and I just have to write notes. These notes are also in geospace. So as we pan and zoom around, they stay on the chart just like it was a paper chart that I drew this note on. It's really handy. I think this helps a lot for students as we have a conversation. Where is your turnaround point? Where what would you do if you were here and you ran into trouble? And we can have a conversation just like it was a paper chart, and I was able to jot notes on there for them. If I need to get rid of any of those notes, I can just hit the clear annotations up along the top there and clear any of my notes off once I've got them all written on. If I don't happen to have an Apple Pencil, I can hit the little annotations icon along the left-hand side, and that'll allow me to do the same thing just by using my finger to draw along the screen. In the upper left, I've got the ability to kind of change what that annotation looks like. So I can just highlight something by changing the opacity. I can make a thicker line, thinner line, draw in different colors. I really have a lot of options here to make different notes for students so that they're more up to speed and they don't get lost in my notes as we're going through a flight. Once we've got that cross-country planned, once we're all ready to go, I'm going to want to make sure that I have that on my device as well. We do a lot of planning on the student's iPad as we go through everything because that's where they did a lot of their initial planning, and that's where I want them to have the most notes possible. But I'm going to want that same flight on my device. And this is pretty easy to accomplish by simply pressing the Send To button on the Maps page under the flight plan drawer. And if the two iPads are on the same Wi-Fi network, as very many of us are when we're in an FBO or even just a hangar that happens to be equipped with Wi-Fi, I'm going to see my other iPad as one of the devices that I can simply send a flight to. Tapping on that is going to go ahead and give my other iPad a notification that I can go ahead and see that route. One of the other great aspects is all of our Sentry line of ADSB devices use Wi-Fi as the communications technology behind it. So if I have multiple devices connected to my Sentry ADSB unit, I can actually do this over that Sentry. I can send flights back and forth via Wi-Fi. Very handy to have. So we talked a lot about how to go ahead and introduce the EFB, kind of some basic information on how to put together a plan for training course outlines. Now let's get a little bit more into the actual flying with the EFB. So one of the things I like is, just like every other system in the aircraft, we now rely pretty heavily on these EFBs. And for many of us, this means that if our EFB is not working correctly, we're probably not going to fly the aircraft that day. So the same way we check our engines and we check the rest of our aircraft, we want to go ahead and make sure that we check our EFB systems as pre-flight. So some things that we want as part of our EFB checklist. We want to make sure that we're up to date with both Foreflight and iOS. Now iOS, we actually don't always want to update automatically. We on our Foreflight website, we actually have a banner where you can see if we've cleared the latest version of iOS with Foreflight to ensure that there aren't any dependencies that are going to break in there. With Foreflight, we also recommend that you update that software when you're on the ground, not right as you're about to walk out to a flight. We take a lot of care to ensure that changes aren't too drastic in there, but the last place you want to be as you try and figure out what changed in your software is when you're on an approach trying to fly the aircraft. We want to make sure that we check the battery. We want to make sure that our device is fully charged so that we can have it available to us for as much of the flight as possible. Carry spare batteries for particularly long flights. Have a way to charge it in the air. A lot of our aircraft are now equipped with USB ports in them, and we have the ability to charge our device in flight. This is a really important thing to have for us, as if the iPad is not charged, we can't use our EFB. Make sure that we're current on all of our charts and data using the download section in there. This is a really handy time to use Pack. Pack is a little suitcase icon under the flight plan drawer on the maps page. And it allows Foreflight to check to make sure that you have all of the data that you're going to need for that flight downloaded in there. Have backups with you. Same way we mentioned right at the start there. Make sure that I have backups and make sure that I've run this checklist on all of those devices as well, as a backup doesn't do very much good if it's not charged and doesn't have any data downloaded on it. What other additional hardware do I have with me? Do I have my Sentry and have that ready to go? Is that charged? Do I have the cords that I might need for that? And then how are you going to use this iPad in flight? I often like to fly with my iPad just in a simple knee board. It makes it easy for me to pull it off the knee board and potentially show something to somebody. But are you going to be using a yoke mount? Are you going to be using a RAM mount somewhere in the aircraft? How are you going to have that iPad secured? And do you have all of that equipment with you? And I think one of the most important things is remember to have done all of this before you get out to the airport. It's very easy to think, oh, I'll get out there and I'll have all my stuff with me. So many times I've had a student come and as we're getting ready for pre-flight and tell me that their iPad isn't charged or doesn't have data downloaded on it. And that means that we're sitting there not flying the airplane, waiting for the device to get charged, waiting for data to get downloaded on there. Make sure you run through all of this before your flight and that you're all ready to go. And luckily, Foreflight's got an EFB checklist built right into the checklist app so that you don't have to remember all of that. You can go through and check that you've got everything charged, you've got data on everything, and that you've got all of your flight planning activities ready to go. That's just an EFB checklist in our normal checklist section. Speaking of checklists inside of Foreflight, another great option for us to add additional information for our students. So I'm in the checklist tab. I'm going to hit the plus button up top there. I'm going to search for our aircraft for flight today, so our 172, and then I can select the model that makes sense for me. And now I've got all of the standard POH checklist brought across into Foreflight where I can tap through everything. I can have all that information ready to go right there on my iPad. But there's another thing we can do. Let's say we're here on our cruise checklist. I can hit the edit button and then the new check item, and I can actually add a challenge and response with notes to my Foreflight checklist. So maybe I want the student on this particular day to make sure that they check their nav log cruise speed, calculate it, make sure that it matches our planned performance, because we've got an early cross-country student here. And then I can save that into that checklist right there on maybe a student's device. So as they're going through their normal cruise checklist, they're going to come across their navlog cruise speed check, and they're going to remember to do that. So they don't get back from a solo cross country and not have any of that information written down and not have gotten as much value out of that flight as they could have. Foreflight also has the ability to speak things for me. This is, I think, huge when running through emergencies with students. So I can actually just tap out my speak button, and Foreflight can go through and read those aloud to me so that they can go through. It'll read radio transmit mayday for me, heavy objects secured as we go through. And I think that one's great, especially if we're expecting someone to fly single pilot, potentially IFR. It's already such a huge overload. Why not have sort of a robotic co-pilot there to help them go through emergency checklist, make sure we hit all of the items in the correct flow that they're supposed to be done in, and they don't have to stress so much about trying to switch back and forth visually to their checklist. I mentioned our Sentry earlier. The Sentry is our ADSB line up here. So we've got a couple of models available to you. We've got the full-size Sentry and the Sentry Mini, and they are fantastic things to bring into the cockpit with us, both as instructors and with students. It's going to allow them to see things like in-flight traffic, in-flight weather. I use this so much for just situational awareness in a busy traffic pattern or a busy practice area, to make sure that while we're practicing a maneuver and I'm focused on teaching the student, that, I've got at least some sense of where aircraft in the area are. They come in at $299 and $499 for the Sentry Mini and the Sentry. They've got great tools that work inside of Foreflight. They can add a lot of things. The full-size Sentry even has things like a CO monitor and a built-in AHARS backup attitude indicator for us that allows us to drive synthetic vision. Great tools to have to just boost that situational awareness and let us focus more on teaching the student than necessarily having to keep an eye on everything else. So let's look at a couple of in-flight tools that we can use with our students, specifically in instructing. So situational awareness, as I mentioned, one of the big things that we can have have with our student, and the big things that EFBs boost for us in flight. So right now, here we are looking at breadcrumbs from a recorded track log. So the green line that we see on there is recorded and shown on the map automatically by having the breadcrumbs feature selected. And I've got a couple of steep turns, it looks like, about halfway through our flight. And this is very easy for me as we go through. It looks like one of those was a little bit tighter than the other. Maybe we, stopped, we fixated on the wrong instrument. Maybe we lost some altitude. Maybe something else happened in there. I can easily show a student as we were flying through what the effect of whatever that issue was had on their actual flight path. Something that I'm not necessarily able to show them just by saying you were too tight on that turn. You lost altitude on that turn. I can now show them the actual impact of where we were flying over. Great to have in real time on the maps page as we fly through certain maneuvers. Content packs are a feature that flight schools and organizations can use to include specific information for their operations. You can actually make a whole airport with approach plates, or in this case, we're looking at practice areas around an airport. If you're an operation that has set known practice areas around your airport, why not have a content pack layer that your students and instructors can use to make sure that they remain inside of that practice area when they're as they go through, and not into somewhere where someone else might be flying. Particularly, again, as it looks like we're practicing some more steep turns, maybe a rectangular course here. I think maybe that's an 8-zone pylon. As we go through those maneuvers, we don't have to worry about drifting into another practice area. And synthetic vision. This is, I think, super useful if you're actually flying around with an instrument student and you want to keep an eye on exactly where you are as you fly through different approaches. Having the synthetic vision up not only can be useful for students when they're in partial panel, but as an instructor on an actual instrument approach, it allows me to go through and have that little bit of backup so I can focus more on the student flying the approach and what they're doing, what they need to work on, because I can already see outside the aircraft like that. I can also see traffic through this, which I think is also really handy for low visibility situations where maybe we've got some haze, we're approaching a traffic pattern. I can see traffic through that synthetic vision and have a heads up on where everybody is around the airport. Emergencies, man, that's where we earn our bread and butter as instructors. Since it's not a good flight if you haven't given at least one emergency to practice in there. So we always love to fail an engine. We always love to fail something, set something on fire for you. But what are you going to do when something goes wrong in the aircraft with your EFB? So the same way that we practice all of those power offs, are we practicing emergencies using this device? What are you going to do when your EFB fails? Just like a takeoff briefing, what are you going to do if your engine fails on takeoff? So mention it again here. The easiest solution is just to have a backup. Like I said, I used to fail EFBs on students to make sure that they were ready to go and had their devices set up and ready. There's nothing like them being able to just reach in the back seat into the flight bag, pull out another iPad, reach into their pocket, pull out an iPhone with everything loaded up and ready to go. The simplest solution to an EFB emergency is simply another device that you can run your EFB on. But you don't always have that possibility in there. And so it's good to run through some different scenarios with students. how do you troubleshoot your device? There's some basic app and iPad skills, like here where I can fully quit kill app Foreflight and relaunch it if something were to happen. Understanding how to get to this screen inside of my iPad is one of those kind of how does my engine work things. If I understand how the iPad works on its software, I can diagnose things, I can do things to fix it the same way that I know to turn carb heat on inside of my aircraft. Practice these scenarios. Create different scenarios for your students to go through and fly. You can actually disable parts of the flight. So you can go through and disable own ship in the settings. That's the little airplane icon that shows you where you are. You can disable own ship and have students practice a GPS failure of their device. Have them use it just as a paper chart in that case. Practice, partial panel things. Tell them that they can look at the airports page, but they can't look at the maps page. Or they can only fly approaches using the plates page and not, geo-referenced plates up on the map on there. Practice different scenarios, just like we do when we say that an ADC fails or an AHRS fails in the aircraft. And then remember that we can also use these tools in our actual emergency training. So it doesn't have to be the source of an emergency, it can be the solution to an emergency for us. So, in the real world, if a student were to go partial panel, we want them to use all of the tools that they have available. We don't really want them to be like, well, in training, I used to fly with only a couple of instruments and I always made it through in the sim. Why not now? If there's a tool available to them, like being able to use an AHRS chip in an ADSB unit, to look at synthetic vision, to have an approach plate with radar and the approach path loaded up in here, and have all of that information at their disposal, how can the EFB help them get through an emergency safer? As that's what we're going to want them to do in the real world, is use all of those tools. And we want to make sure that they stay sharp on the ground. We practice these same techniques when we're going through flight training, and then we make students go through recurrent training every couple of years. We want to do the same thing with all of our EFB skills. Luckily, there's a lot of great simulators out there that you can actually pair with Foreflight, so that you can practice these maneuvers from Redbird to Infinite Flight as a mobile version that I really like to be able to use when we're talking and demoing things inside of Foreflight. So tons of great tips out there for pairing your simulator with Foreflight. We actually have a webinar on that, and then using those to practice those skills on the ground. Let's talk about some debrief tools, some post-flight tools that we have with our students. This is one of the most important things that we can do with our student is get them back on the ground after a flight and talk about all of the things that they could do better, all of the ways that they can improve as students for their next flight. So inside of Foreflight, I've got a fully built out digital logbook where I can go through and review all of my flights and have information in there. This is also a legal logbook. If students want to use a digital logbook, this is an excellent option for them as it's just included in their Foreflight subscription. Inside of an actual entry, I can link a track log to a logbook entry and then see information about that particular track log. So tapping on the track log will expand it out and it will let me see different things like altitude and speed, pitch and bank if I have an AHRS chip with me on like a Sentry, and then let me see my whole track log as we fly through maneuvers. This makes it pretty easy for me to, say, zoom in on an airport here and look at all of the touch and goes from a BFR of mine a couple of years ago. Maybe I forgot to count how many landings we have. I can tell you exactly how many landings we did in the aircraft that day because I'm able to go through and basically just count laps around the traffic pattern as we go through. Looks like I managed to keep reasonably steady that day. We're pretty even across most of those there. I think you can even see a short approach here that we make. Cut that one approach in just a little bit tighter. So you can see some of the great ways that we can review these things with students. And we can take it even a step further on our performance tier by selecting the 3D button and actually seeing that same flight in 3D. So we can review what that approach looked like on that same satellite overlaid onto terrain. Looking at our approach here to a runway, we can talk about, how are you at this point? Are you too high? Are you too low? How's your directional control looking? Are we on center line? You can go through and look at so much of that information as we fly down. Inside of that logbook, there's also a couple of specific instructor tools that make our lives, at least as instructors, a little bit easier and a little bit faster. So the first one in there is digital signature. Now this is actually allows me to go through and set in all of my instructor information from my instructor number, my expiration for my certificate, my email, and even save a signature onto my device so that whenever I make an endorsement from that device, it can carry over all of that information to it. And then I have an endorsement record that allows me to see the different endorsements that I've made. Their status, if they're a draft in this case, or looks like Lukeman may have declined one of my solo cross countries there. So I can see the status of remote endorsements that I've actually sent to students. And if I want to send them a new one, I can simply hit the plus button in the upper right-hand corner there, type in their information. You can see that my signature and my CFI information has already been brought over. And then I can type the lookup and I can search through all of Foreflight's database of pre-filled in endorsements out of the AC. So I can go through and select, and say this one, the repeated cross-country flights in there, and it's brought in a lot of the information from the student's name, the language out of the AC, so that all I need to do is fill in the airport names and list any conditions or limitations that the student needs to follow for that. Like I said, it's going to carry over my my signature and my instructor information in here and make that just a lot easier for me to fill out. Students also have access to a logbook report if they've been using the digital logbook. So tons of great options in here. From an 8710, the easiest way to fill this out is to, instead of having to go through and calculate out your night flights or your night cross country for every one of your flights in there, you can just hit the 8710 and Foreflight can calculate all of those fields for you. But one that I think is very helpful for students and a place that I like to start for a lot of 61 students is like the private pilot, the commercial, the instrument in here, where students can actually go through and see all of the requirements for them to receive that rating or certificate. And they know exactly what they're getting themselves into. How close are they on their 40 hours of flight time? Have they flown the correct cross country? What cross country worked there for them? Do they have all of the training in the last 2 months that they need? This checklist is a great place to start with students so they understand exactly what they're getting themselves into, and then they can actually see themselves progress through each of our flight lessons. So they can see how much closer they're getting to each of these requirements. And then they get to celebrate when one of those requirements gets a nice big green checkbox next to it. Keeps them a little more motivated, keeps them over those plateaus, and continuing on their flight training. You also have the ability to add additional information like photos to a particular cross-country entry or a particular logbook entry. I think this is fantastic as we all have devices with us as we're flying. It's very easy for us to take pictures of students flying, take pictures of cool landmarks that we flew over, or interesting airplanes that were on the ramp when we landed. Different things that can help a student remember that great flight. We can add tons of comments to each of these entries, way more than we used to be able to with a paper logbook. And we can give them reminders of things to work on and what exact maneuvers we worked on. And these are just so helpful when a student wants to look back and look back at that good cross country where we went over the coast and we got to see that cool twin. And that just keeps them more motivated. It reminds them of all the lessons they learned on that flight and helps them continue on their flight training. So my last bit that I want to leave you with here is just like when we introduced, the initial GPS, just like when we introduced glass cockpits before them, EFBs have the ability to greatly increase our abilities to operate the aircraft. But instructors, we need to make sure that we're teaching our students the correct ways to use all of these things. If we're mad at students for just flying the magenta line as they go through, that's as instructors, we've not taught them the correct way to fly GPS as we go through. So we want to teach this EFB skills that we want other pilots in the traffic pattern with us to have so that they can be safe pilots around us. And Foreflight's there to help. So I've got a couple of things here for you. We're always on frequency at team@foreflight.com. This is our pilot support team. They're a great resource to have to answer any of your questions on your subscription, to your, how to use things in Foreflight. One of the best things about the pilot support team, we call them fanatical pilot support, is that they are all pilots in there, and that to me is such a game changer when it comes to getting support on a technical product like this, because I don't even need to know what I want to do inside of Foreflight. I just need to know what I want to do inside the airplane. And then I've got a fellow pilot who's an expert in Foreflight who's going to be able to give me solutions inside of the program to meet that need that I have. Huge help to have, and we're really proud of that team. They do fantastic work. I wanted to throw up the plans and pricing that we have available here and some of the things that are included in each of those plans. We've got our basic plus at $99, our pro plus at $199, and our performance plus tier at $299. They include fantastic things in there. Each level can be great for an operator depending on what type of lessons that you're doing, what type of things your student wants to have inside of the aircraft. You can go onto our website to foreflight.com/pricing, and you can get detailed breakdowns on exactly what each of these features mean and figure out exactly which one would work best for you. And then as just a treat here, I wanted to remind everybody that NAFI and SAFE actually offer discounts with Foreflight. So if you're a member of either NAFI or SAFE, you can get, I think it's a 33% discount, a third off on there from your Foreflight subscription. Definitely makes it worth being a member of one of these great organizations, and knocks a little bit of price off that Foreflight subscription for you, so that you can have all the tools that you need to teach students more effectively. And that's all we've got for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us and talking about how we can use EFBs to teach students more effectively. I think this is something that as instructors we need to take. We need to really kind of take the helm here and figure out exactly what we want to show students, how we want to teach them inside of this new technology, so that they become safe pilots as they fly around. I'm Thomas Daugherty. Thank you for joining us.